Your team scores, not your country, not your job, not your family. Your team scores a goal in a World Cup match you have no actual stake in beyond loyalty, and for about 4 seconds you stop being a calm, reasonable adult. You're screaming. You're hugging a stranger in a bar you've never spoken to before. Your hands are shaking a little. And somewhere underneath all of it, if you slowed down enough to notice, you'd realize you're not entirely yourself right now. You're something else, briefly. This isn't really about football. It's about what happens to your sense of identity the moment you fuse it with something bigger than you, and psychology has been quietly mapping exactly what that does to your brain for decades. Start with the merge itself, because before the chanting and the shaking hands, something has to happen first. Your brain has to stop drawing a clear line between me and my team. Researchers call this identity fusion, a concept developed by social psychologist William Swan, and it describes something stronger than just liking a group. Fusion is when the boundary between your personal identity and your group identity gets thin enough that a threat to the group registers in your brain almost like a threat to you personally. This is why a loss in a World Cup match can genuinely sting in your chest the same way personal disappointment does, even though nothing in your actual life has changed. Your team didn't just lose. For a few minutes, some closed-off corner of your mind insists that you did too. That fusion explains why the language shifts the way it does. Listen to yourself during a match, and you'll notice you stop saying they and start saying we. We need a goal. We're down a man. We got robbed by that call. Linguists and psychologists studying fan behavior have pointed out that this pronoun shift isn't just a figure of speech. It's a measurable signal of how far your identity has stretched to include a group of athletes you've never met, wearing a jersey that has nothing to do with your actual day-to-day life. Your brain doesn't really distinguish between my action and my group's action once the fusion is strong enough. It just files both under self. Here's the part that explains the actual shaking hands, can't sit still feeling. Your body isn't just reacting emotionally, it's reacting chemically, almost identically to how it would during a real personal threat or a real personal triumph. Studies measuring testosterone in sports fans have found that male fans of a winning team show a measurable spike in testosterone after the result, the same hormonal response you'd expect from someone who personally won a competition, not someone who watched one from a couch. Fans of the losing team show the opposite, a drop mirroring what happens after personal defeat. Cortisol, the stress hormone, climbs during close, high-stakes matches in a way that mimics real danger, even though you are, objectively, sitting safely in a chair. Your nervous system never got the memo that this is just a game. As far as your body's concerned, the tribe is under threat, and you're wired to feel that as if it's happening to you directly. So, quick question while we're here, because this is the kind of thing that splits people almost exactly down the middle. Have you ever caught yourself genuinely shaking, or close to tears, over a result in a sport you have zero personal involvement in? Drop it in the comments, because the answer says more about how your brain forms identity than you'd expect. There's also a name for the specific high you feel when your team wins, separate from the relief of just not losing. It's called BIRGing, basking in reflected glory. A term coined by psychologist Robert Cialdini in a now well-known study, where he found that university students were significantly more likely to wear school-branded clothing the Monday after their football team won than after it lost. The win itself had nothing to do with anything any of those students personally did, and yet they wanted to visibly associate themselves with it anyway. That's BIRGing, borrowing the achievement of a group you're fused to and letting it boost your own sense of identity, even though you didn't kick a single ball. After a World Cup win, you'll see the opposite of subtlety. Flags out of windows, horns in the street, strangers high-fiving on the subway, and what's actually happening underneath all of it is thousands of individual identities temporarily expanding to include a victory none of them personally earned. And the flip side of BIRGing is just as real and just as well documented: CORFing, cutting off reflected failure. After a loss, fans distance themselves from the team almost instinctively. The pronouns shift right back to they. The jersey stays in the drawer the next day. You'll hear people say they choked instead of we choked, even though 12 hours earlier, during the match itself, it was very much we. This isn't hypocrisy, it's a genuinely protective psychological move. Your identity expands to absorb glory and contracts to avoid absorbing failure almost automatically, almost without your permission. Now, if you've ever wondered why a stadium or even a packed bar during a World Cup final can feel like something close to a spiritual experience, there's a concept for that too, and it's surprisingly old. The sociologist Emil Durkheim, writing more than a century ago, described something he called collective effervescence, the intense, almost euphoric energy that arises when a large group of people focus on the same thing at the same time, especially during ritual, chanting, or shared emotional peaks. Durkheim was originally describing religious ceremonies, but modern psychologists studying crowds at sporting events have found the same mechanism: firing, synchronized chanting, synchronized breathing, synchronized emotional highs and lows, all of it dissolving the usual boundary you feel between yourself and the strangers around you. For a few minutes during a World Cup match, the gap between me and everyone else wearing this color genuinely narrows, and that narrowing is part of why the moment feels so much bigger than a sports result has any logical right to feel. If any of this is reframing something you've actually felt and never had a name for, that's kind of the whole point of this channel, and a like helps put it in front of more people who felt exactly the same thing without ever knowing why. There's also a more practical reason strangers feel like temporary friends during a match. Oxytocin, the hormone associated with bonding and trust, has been shown in research to rise in group settings involving shared emotional experiences, especially under synchronized activity like chanting, singing, or collectively reacting to a dramatic moment. It's the same chemical involved in bonding between parents and children, or between close friends, and it's part of why hugging a stranger after a last-minute goal doesn't feel as strange in the moment as it would literally any other time. Your brain, chemically, has briefly decided this person is part of your circle, because right now, you're both reacting to the same threat and the same relief, at the same time, in sync. Underneath all of this sits something evolutionary psychologists have argued for a long time. Humans didn't evolve in a world of nation-states and broadcast television, but we did evolve in small tribal groups where coalition and group loyalty were directly tied to survival. The brain systems responsible for us versus them thinking, for caring intensely about the success of your group and feeling threatened by the success of a rival group, weren't built for football. They were built for actual tribal conflict, resource competition, and group survival, and they never fully went away. A World Cup match gives those ancient systems a perfectly safe, low-stakes outlet, a them to compete against, a we to belong to, a result that genuinely feels like it matters, without any of the real danger that those systems originally evolved to respond to. So here's something worth sitting with for a second. Out of everything we've covered, which part do you think is doing the most work in that moment your team scores? Is it the identity fusion, the hormonal spike, the crowd effect, or something underneath all three? Genuinely curious where you'd land on that, because the researchers behind these studies still argue about which mechanism dominates. There's one more piece worth mentioning, because it explains why the entire experience can feel like a brief escape from yourself in the best way. Psychologists studying flow states and crowd psychology have pointed to something called transient hypofrontality, a temporary dip in activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for self-monitoring, second-guessing, and constant internal narration. Under intense focus, rhythm, and shared emotional arousal, exactly the conditions of a packed stadium or a tense penalty shootout, that self-monitoring quiets down. That's part of why you can lose track of time, scream without embarrassment, hug strangers without hesitation, and feel, for a moment, lighter than usual. The version of you that's constantly evaluating yourself goes quiet, and what's left is just the moment, and the result, and the people around you feeling it too. If you've made it this far, you clearly like understanding the why behind the things you feel but never question, which is exactly what this channel is built around. So subscribing means you won't miss the next one, and there's a lot more of this kind of thing coming. So the next time your team scores in a World Cup match and you find yourself somewhere between euphoric and slightly out of control, hugging someone you've never met, shouting in a language your normal, composed self would never use in public, that's not you losing your mind. That's identity fusion, hormonal mimicry of real threat and triumph, collective effervescence, oxytocin-driven bonding, and a quieted-down self-monitoring system, all firing at once, all borrowed from systems your brain built for tribal survival millions of years before anyone invented a ball. You're not a different person when your team wins. You're a much older version of yourself, briefly let off the leash.